My fiancé, a respected Wall Street banker, spent $35 million on a lavish party at a historic estate in Newport, and he said, "It's to celebrate my success." But in front of everyone, he called me just a detail in his life. I was frozen. When I asked where all that money came from, he smiled and said, "You were never smart enough to understand." So I made the hardest decision of my life: to find out everything. Hello, my name is Camille Reed. I'm 45 years old and welcome to this channel. If you're hearing this story for the first time, subscribe now, like this video, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I was born in Chicago in a working-class neighborhood on the South Side to an ordinary family. My father worked in construction. My mother was a secretary at an elementary school. We didn't have much, but we had the essentials: dignity, honesty, and the certainty that nothing is worth more than a clear conscience. I grew up with those values. I carried them with me my whole life, and for a long time I thought they would protect me from everything. I was wrong. When I met Julian Thorne, I was 43. I had been an independent financial consultant for 15 years. I wasn't rich, but I was free. I knew my job better than anyone. I paid my bills and slept well at night. That was enough for me. Julian was 52 when we met at a business gala in New York City. Tall, with graying temples and clear eyes that seemed to be constantly analyzing everything they saw. He wore a suit that was probably worth more than my monthly rent. But what struck me wasn't his money. It was the way he spoke. Calm, precise, with that quiet confidence of people who have nothing left to prove. At least that's what I thought. An international banker, one of the most respected in America, they said. Governments consulted him. Investment funds mentioned his name in their reports. Financial magazines published his analyses with a reverence I had never seen granted to a single man. Julian Thorne was, by all accounts, a living institution. And he chose me. For 2 years, he showed me a world I had never touched. Dinners in Michelin-starred restaurants, where the menu didn't list prices. Weekends in the Hamptons, where the people we passed in hotel corridors were names I only knew from the news. The first time we flew on a private jet, I remember looking out the window and silently wondering if any of it was real. But there was something, a small thing, a discomfort I couldn't quite name that I chose to ignore every time it surfaced. Julian never talked to me about his business. It wasn't forgetfulness, it wasn't distraction. It was deliberate. Every time I asked a question about his activities, his clients, his projects, he would respond with that same slightly condescending smile and the same phrase I learned to recognize as a closed door. "You don't need to worry your pretty little head about that, darling." And I would nod. I would smile and move on because I loved him, because I trusted him, because I told myself that every relationship has its gray areas, and his were just larger than average. It was a mistake, the biggest of my life. Everything changed one evening in October 2024. Julian was traveling. I don't even remember where. There were so many trips that the destinations blurred together. I was alone in our penthouse on the Upper East Side, a massive triplex, 16 rooms, a rooftop garden with a fountain that never stopped. Beautiful as a painting, cold as a museum. I was looking for a book I had left in his office, nothing more. I had no intention of snooping. I went in, looked at the shelves, and that's when I saw his computer screen still on. I shouldn't have looked, but I did. It was a spreadsheet, detailed, organized with the precision of someone who had been doing this for decades. And at the top of the page, in sober, discreet letters, a title: Newport Estate Event. Final budget. I moved closer and saw the number. $35 million. I felt my breath catch, literally as if something in my chest had simply decided to pause, while my brain processed what it had just read. There were line items for everything: private helicopters, suites at the Chandler Vintage Napa Wines I only knew by name, flowers imported from the Netherlands, celebrity chefs, private jets chartered from New York, Zurich, Dubai, Sao Paulo. A list of cities that read like a series of conquests. And in the field, purpose of event, a single phrase: personal success celebration, select guests. I closed the laptop. I sat down on the cold marble floor and stayed there in the dark for maybe 20 minutes. Not moving, not crying, not doing anything, but staring into the void. It wasn't the money that terrified me. It was something else. Something I couldn't yet name, as if that spreadsheet was the first page of a book I wasn't sure I wanted to finish. I went to bed without saying anything and decided to wait to see what this party would reveal. I didn't know that night that what I was about to discover in the coming weeks would surpass anything I could have imagined. That behind the numbers on that screen was a reality that dozens of families had paid for without ever knowing it. That the man who had been sleeping in my bed for 2 years wasn't just wealthy and secretive, he was something far more dangerous. And I, who had spent my life analyzing financial structures, reading between the lines of balance sheets, sensing when something was wrong, had chosen not to look. Until that October night, until that spreadsheet opened on a glowing screen in the dark. Sometimes the truth doesn't knock. It waits quietly for you to enter the room where it resides. And when you finally look it in the face, you understand that nothing will ever be the same. In the next part, the party takes place, the guests arrive, and Julian Thorne will show in front of hundreds of people exactly who he is and what he thinks of me. The party was in November 2024. We took a private jet from Teterboro. Julian wore a custom-tailored dark suit, a watch I had never seen on his wrist, and a mood I couldn't read. I wore a dress I had thought was beautiful when I put it on, but which suddenly felt out of place, though I couldn't say why. During the entire flight, he reviewed documents on his tablet. He barely spoke to me. The historic estate in Newport is one of the most beautiful places I have ever seen. A Gilded Age mansion perched on the cliffs overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, a place where history itself seems to hold its breath. That night, it was closed to the public. Julian had made it his private domain for 48 hours. 340 guests. Faces I recognized from financial magazines, political talk shows, from photographs alongside heads of state. Swiss bankers, U.S. Senator I had seen on C-SPAN just weeks before investors from the Middle East, Brazilian industrialists. Names I will not mention here, but which everyone in that world knows. They arrived by helicopter, by luxury cars, by jet. Men and women who moved in an atmosphere where every detail was calibrated to remind everyone that they were part of a world inaccessible to ordinary mortals. And I was there on Julian Thorne's arm. Beautiful, elegant, smiling. The perfect detail. For the first few hours, I tried to be present, to participate in conversations, to be the woman I thought I was. Intelligent, curious, capable of holding my own in any room. But I quickly understood that wasn't what was expected of me that night. Julian greeted each guest with calculated warmth. He laughed loudly, shook hands, gave hugs. And I walked by his side, or rather 2 steps behind. It wasn't an accident. I realized that soon enough. Every time a guest looked at me with curiosity, Julian would wait a fraction of a second before introducing me, as if my mention was an afterthought, a detail he had almost forgotten to include. "Oh, and this is Camille, my fiancé." Without looking me in the eye, without pausing, already turning to the next person. I clenched my teeth, I smiled, I carried on. Then came the moment I will never forget. We were in a group. Julian was conversing with several men, including a Texan oil magnate named Clay, a big, jovial man with a thick accent and eyes that took in everything. Clay had been looking at me with genuine curiosity since we arrived. At one point, he turned to Julian with an admiring grin and said, "Julian, how do you manage it all? The business, the projects, and on top of that, a woman as remarkable as this by your side." There was a second of silence, just 1 second, and then Julian smiled, that wide smile I had loved for 2 years. And he said, his voice loud enough for the whole group to hear, casual enough to seem like a joke. "Clay, let's be honest. A man like me can have whatever he wants. Camille is beautiful, she's elegant, she fits the environment. I pulled her out of mediocrity. Without me, she'd still be some forgotten consultant in a Chicago cubicle." Laughter. Some of it awkward, some of it genuinely amused. I smiled. I don't know where that smile came from. It was automatic, a survival reflex my body had developed without consulting me. My face was smiling while something inside me was silently collapsing, cleanly without a sound, like very thin glass, shattering without a single shard flying. She knows she owes me everything. Julian continued, taking a glass of champagne from a passing tray. She's smart enough to understand her place. Clay, looking visibly uncomfortable, changed the subject. I kept smiling. The rest of the evening passed in a strange haze. I saw the people, I heard the conversations, but I was somewhere else inside myself, in that silent space where the real decisions are made. The ones that make no noise but change everything. Later that night, when we were alone for a moment on a terrace overlooking the sea, I placed my hand on his arm and asked him softly, with all the gentleness I could still muster, "Julian, where does all this money come from? For the party, for everything." "Where exactly?" He looked at me with that expression between boredom and condescension that I knew so well, but which that night I saw for the first time without filter of love. "Camille," he said my name like one speaks to a child, slowly, with a feigned patience that held all the contempt in the world. "You were never smart enough to understand how real money works." And he turned his back on me. I stayed on that terrace, alone, the crisp New England wind in my hair, the sound of the waves below the lights of the party behind me, and that sentence echoing in my head, an echo you can't turn off. I went to the powder room at the estate. I closed the door. I sat on the edge of a marble vanity that was probably worth more than my first car, and looked at myself in the mirror for a long time. The woman looking back wasn't crying. She was deciding, not out of anger. The anger was there somewhere, but it wasn't what was guiding me. What guided me was something else. Something colder and more solid, a certainty that had settled in without warning, like those truths you carry for a long time without giving them a name. This man had spent $35 million on a party. He couldn't explain where the money came from. He humiliated me in front of hundreds of people. He treated those around him like accessories, and he smiled calmly, with the absolute certainty that no one in his life would ever have the courage or the means to hold him accountable. He was wrong. That night in Newport, while Julian was toasting with senators and billionaires, I made the most important decision of my life. I wasn't going to leave him quietly. I wasn't going to disappear discreetly with my suitcases and my wounded dignity. I wasn't going to pretend nothing had happened. I was going to find the truth. All of it. And if I had to, I would deliver it to those who could do something with it. I didn't yet know what this decision would unleash. I didn't yet know what I would find. I didn't yet know that behind the numbers on that spreadsheet, and behind that man's smile, was something that went beyond my worst nightmares. But I knew one thing. The real game had just begun. And this time, I was holding the cards. In the next part, I returned to New York. I set the first stage of the plan in motion, and the man who will help me discovers something within the first 72 hours that I was not prepared to hear. I returned to New York 2 days after the party. Julian went directly to Geneva. A last-minute meeting as always. No explanation, no details, just a kiss on the forehead and a "Don't wait up," said, as he put on his jacket. Already gone. Already in his next boardroom, his next deal, his next world where I didn't really exist. I was alone in the Upper East Side penthouse. This home I had learned to occupy without ever truly inhabiting it. Its 16 rooms echoed differently when you were alone. The rooftop garden with its perpetual fountain seemed almost mocking that night, something that kept running only to remind you how everything here was maintained, calibrated, kept in a state of perfect appearance. I didn't sleep. I sat in Julian's office, that large room with walls covered in books that smelled of leather and old paper. And I thought, not snooping, not yet, just thinking with that particular calm that comes when you've made a grave decision and are beginning to measure its true weight. There was one thing I knew how to do better than almost anyone: read a financial structure. 15 years as a consultant had taught me to recognize the smell of clean money, and the smell of money that has been washed, folded, and restructured until it looks clean. That party had the second smell. $35 million spent in 48 hours with no apparent business objective by a man whose declared net worth barely justified a tenth of that sum. I needed help. A name came to mind: Mark Jensen. We had worked together briefly years ago in a very different context. He had left the private sector to start a discreet corporate investigation firm specializing in financial tracking, legal surveillance evidence gathering. The kind of man whose face you don't remember after passing him in a hallway, which in his line of work was the most important quality. I called him at 11 p.m. He picked up on the second ring. "Jensen." "Mark, it's Camille Reed. I need to talk to you." Not on the phone. A short pause. No surprise, no unnecessary questions. "Tomorrow, 9 a.m. Corner coffee shop in Greenwich Village. We met the next morning amid the quiet flow of a Tuesday in Manhattan. Mark Jensen was a man in his 50s, so discreet he was almost invisible. The kind of person you wouldn't notice if he sat next to you on the subway. That was precisely what made him valuable. He ordered a black coffee, watched me sit down, and waited. I told him everything. The spreadsheet, the party, the humiliations, the unexplained trips, the locked-door meetings, the half-spoken sentences I sometimes caught before he changed the subject. And the millions. Those $35 million that couldn't have come from nowhere. Mark listened without interrupting me once. When I finished, he was silent for a moment. Then he said in a steady, measured voice, like someone weighing each word before placing it on the table, "Julian Thorne." I've heard that name before. In what context? He looked at me. In a context that, if confirmed, is much bigger than an expensive party. He didn't say more at that moment, but the way he said it, that restraint, that precision, like someone who knows the exact weight of his own words, was enough to make something shift in my chest. We laid out the plan. Mark would enter the house as my personal assistant. I would convince Julian that I needed someone to manage my schedule, my social commitments, my correspondence. It was plausible. Julian loved the idea of me having staff. It was part of the image he wanted to project. A well-supported fiancé, a well-maintained luxury item. You think you can convince him? Mark asked. Yes, I replied, because he thinks I'm naive, and I've never corrected him. 3 days later, during a private dinner, I brought it up with a lightness I didn't feel. I was thinking about something. With your social calendar, I could really use an assistant. You always say you want me to make a good impression at events. It would really help me. Julian cut his steak without looking up. How much will it cost? Nothing you'd notice. He shrugged. Do whatever you want. Just don't bother me with the details. Mark Jensen entered the house in the second week of December, 2024. With him came equipment no normal personal assistant would have. It took him 4 days to install everything. Bugs in the office, the main living room, and the second-floor meeting room, the one Julian always locked and I had never entered. A tracker on the car. A mirror access to the home network server. All within the limits of what could be used without compromising a future legal case. Mark was meticulous on this point. I don't build cases, he had told me. I build truths. The difference is that truths have to survive lawyers. The first recordings were disappointingly mundane. Calls about wine, orders, conversations with his personal trainer, instructions for the driver. But on the 5th night, something changed. Julian came home late. I was pretending to be asleep. He went straight to his office and locked the door. Mark, from his room on the 3rd floor, activated the microphone. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. The next morning, Mark showed me the transcript without a word. He placed it on the table in front of me and waited for me to read. There were 3 names I didn't recognize, a transfer structure described in technical language that would sound innocent to an untrained ear, and 1 sentence that Mark had highlighted in red. The Cayman Islands transfer needs to be broken up before the end of the quarter. The auditors can't see the consolidated volume. I stared at that sentence for a long time. That's structured evasion, Mark said, probably linked to a much larger chain. But we still need the central link. I looked up at him. Dear listeners, if you are still with this story, please subscribe to this channel now and leave a like. It helps me enormously to continue. And now back to what happened next. We didn't have to look for that link for long. It came to us. Mark called me 2 days later, his voice different, more contained than usual. You need to meet someone. A man named Arthur Vance. Former compliance officer at Thorns Bank, fired 2 years ago. Why? Because he started asking questions he shouldn't have. I felt something tighten in my chest. And he has proof. Mark took a second before answering. He has something better than proof, Camille. He paused. He has the names. In the next part, I meet Arthur. What he reveals goes beyond anything I had imagined, and for the first time, I understand the true scale of what Julian Thorne had built in the shadows. Arthur Vance lived in a small, discreet apartment in Astoria, Queens, on a quiet street lined with plane trees losing their last leaves in the early December cold. The building was clean but unpretentious. The intercom had a button that didn't work on the first try. The hallway smelled of wood polish and a neighbor's cooking. None of it resembled Julian Thorne's universe. That's exactly why I knew as I pressed the doorbell that this man had paid a real price to be here. He opened the door after a few seconds. Mid-50s, maybe 48, his hair whiter than it should have been for his age, his hands holding the doorknob with a slight tension. He looked at me with open suspicion, making no effort to hide it. Why should I trust you? You're his fiancé. I looked him straight in the eye. I was his fiancé. Now I'm the person who's going to finish what you couldn't. There was a long silence, the kind where you can feel someone weighing a decision that isn't simple. Then he opened the door wide and stepped aside to let me in. We sat in his kitchen. He placed 2 mugs of coffee on the table without asking if I wanted any. An automatic gesture from someone who needs something to do with his hands when talking about difficult things. He began to speak slowly with pauses, like someone who has told this story in his head 100 times, but isn't sure where to start now that he has to say it out loud. 2 years earlier, Arthur was the head of compliance at Julian's bank. His job was to monitor, verify, and ensure that operations adhered to legal and regulatory frameworks. A thankless job in honest institutions, and a dangerous one in others. He had started noticing anomalies in internal reports. Not glaring errors, nothing that would jump out at an untrained eye, but small things. Transfers that didn't match declarations. Beneficiary companies that didn't exist in public registries. Client names that reappeared in different structures in different countries, with amounts that grew without a clearly identifiable origin. It took me 3 months to build an initial internal file, he said, holding his mug with both hands. 3 months to check cross-reference to make sure I wasn't wrong. Because you don't make those kinds of accusations lightly, not against a man like Thorne. And then I requested a meeting with my direct superior. I presented what I had found. He paused, looking at his mug. A week later, I was called into HR. They gave me a box for my personal belongings and a non-disclosure agreement to sign. You signed it. I have kids. I was scared. He said it simply not as an excuse. Just a fact. The reality of one man against a machine far bigger than himself. I signed. A silence. But you didn't give them everything I said. Softly. He looked at me, and for the first time since I'd arrived, something in his face relaxed slightly. No, not everything. He stood up and disappeared into another room for 2 minutes. When he returned, he was holding a thick manila envelope slightly frayed at the corners, like something that's been moved many times without ever deciding what to do with it. He placed it on the table between us. This isn't direct proof, he said. Not enough on its own to build a case. But it's a map. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside were copies of documents, partial statements, names of shell corporations registered in tax havens, dates that coincided with events Julian had publicly presented as simple business trips, and a handwritten list by Arthur himself in blue ink, with names, amounts, and arrows connecting them in a structure that looked like a family tree of invisible money. I took my time reading everything methodically as I would analyze a client's balance sheet. When I looked up, Arthur was watching me. You understand what you're seeing? Yes, I answered. I see the beginning of a chain. Exactly. The beginning. Thorne isn't just a man hiding money. He's a system. An entire architecture built over years with multiple layers, multiple intermediaries, multiple countries. And at the center of it all, he pointed to a name on the handwritten list, a name I had never seen a company registered in Malta, a short generic name that meant nothing to someone who didn't know where to look. This entity, Arthur said, appears in almost every structure I identified directly or indirectly. It's the hub. If you find out what's behind that name, you have everything. I returned to Manhattan that night with the envelope in my bag. Mark was waiting at the penthouse. I gave him everything. He looked through the documents for an hour without a word, taking notes in his notebook with his characteristic absolute focus. Then he put down his pen. Arthur's right. This name, he circled, I've seen it before in another context years ago in an investigation that never went anywhere. He turned to me. That means this structure has been active for at least 7 years, maybe more. 7 years. I thought about that number. 7 years of ghost companies, 7 years during which Julian Thorne had shaken hands, signed deals, been photographed next to respectable people while building something in the shadows that no one saw. Or rather that no one wanted to see. How many families? I asked in a low voice almost to myself. How many people lost money because of this, without ever knowing why? Mark didn't answer right away. That's exactly the question that needs to be asked in front of a judge. That night I thought about the woman I was before all this. The one who came back from a trip on a private jet and wondered if it was real. The one who accepted closed doors, dodged phrases, silences, dressed up as mystery. The one who had chosen not to look because looking would have changed everything. I wondered how long I would have gone on like that if that spreadsheet hadn't been left open that night in the office. Maybe a long time. Maybe years. And that thought was harder to bear than all the rest. Because the truth, the one I didn't want to look at either, was that somewhere without knowing it, without consciously choosing it, I had been a piece in the picture he was painting. The beautiful and elegant fiancé. The luxury detail. The living proof that such a powerful man could also have a life that looked somewhat normal. That night, I decided it was the last time I would be a piece in someone else's picture. From now on, I was the one holding the brush. In the next part, I play the most difficult role of my life. I become the perfect, submissive, adoring fiancé. And Julian, convinced he's untouchable, starts to talk. Far more than he ever should have. Mark told me we needed more. Arthur's documents were a map. The recordings were fragments. What we had so far might embarrass Julian, maybe trigger a preliminary investigation, but it wouldn't destroy him. Not with the absolute certainty I was determined to achieve. Not with the solidity needed for even the most expensive lawyer to be unable to dismantle what we had built. We needed his own voice, his own words, a direct link between him and the operations. He has to talk, Mark told me, one January morning, setting his coffee on the kitchen table. And he only talks when he feels completely in control. I thought for a second. Then we have to give him the impression that he is. Mark looked at me with that particular expression. He sometimes had something between respect and concern, like a man admiring a decision while measuring what it will cost the person making it. Can you do that? I thought of the woman who had smiled for hours in a historic mansion while being humiliated in front of 300 people. I thought of the 2 years of swallowed sentences, withheld questions, accepted doors without looking for the key. I've been doing it for 2 years, I answered. The only difference is that from now on it's intentional. In the weeks that followed, I became a version of myself I barely recognized in the mirror. I started agreeing with everything again, laughing at his jokes, asking questions about his business, with admiring eyes not to discover, but so he could feel that particular pleasure men like him get when they explain things to someone they believe will never reach their level. Julian loved to explain. Loved that feeling of being the sole source of light in a dark room. I started sending him affectionate texts during the day. I'm so proud of you. I've never met a man with your vision. You truly amaze me, you know. I watched him inflate like a balloon, slowly, steadily, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who believes he has everything under control. It wasn't pleasant. I won't pretend it was. Every night as I went to bed, I would lie with my eyes open in the dark for a few minutes, reminding myself why I was doing this. The families, the pension funds, Arthur in his Queen's apartment, with his prematurely white hair. All the invisible parts of a machine no one saw. It was enough. Every time. It was enough. The decisive evening came on a Thursday at the end of January. Julian had come home earlier than expected. We had dinner together with a bottle of rare Napa Cabernet he had carefully selected, and a backdrop of classical music he always played when he was in the mood to feel cultured. He was relaxed, a rare state, like those moments when tightly wound people let something go without realizing it because they feel completely safe. After dinner, he settled onto the living room sofa. He loosened the top button of his shirt, stared at the ceiling for a few seconds, and then began to talk. About New York, about the idiots he worked with, about how he had built everything himself without inheriting anything, without depending on anyone. The usual boasting I had heard dozens of times, which I listened to that night with an attention he never suspected. Then, he said something different. People think they know how money works, he said, still looking at the ceiling as if talking to himself as much as to me. But they don't. Money isn't what's in an account, it's what's in motion. I rested my head on his shoulder gently, with the calculated casualness of someone listening, without really listening. What do you mean in motion? I asked with the soft voice of someone who doesn't quite understand but finds it fascinating. And he talked, not with specific names and numbers, not yet, but with enough detail that Mark, listening to the transcript the next morning, was silent for almost a full minute after the recording ended. Camille, he finally said, what you have here is a man who believes he's so untouchable that he's starting to narrate his own story. Is it enough? Not yet. But we're close. He put down his pen and looked at me. People who think they're untouchable always make the same mistake. Which is, they talk. For the next 3 weeks, Julian talked more than he had in 2 years of living together. Not because he trusted me, but because he had never respected me enough to fear me. He mentioned structures without fully naming them. Countries without specifying details, past operations dressed in vague language that sounded almost like financial philosophy. But behind every sentence, Mark and I saw the outlines of something precise. A system, an architecture, layers upon layers, built with cold, methodical intelligence. Then one evening in early February, Julian left for Zurich. 3 days, he said, closing his suitcase. Don't call me. I didn't call. But as soon as the door closed, I went to his office. He had taken his main laptop as I expected, but there was a second older laptop he rarely used stored in a locked compartment in the central drawer of his desk. Mark had found the combination to the lock weeks earlier on a night when Julian had gone to bed early. I opened the drawer, took out the laptop. I followed the exact steps Mark had shown me, which I had practiced until I knew them by heart. 10 minutes later, I had access to its contents. What I found in those files wasn't just tax evasion. There were contracts with companies registered in the Cayman Islands, Malta, Panama. Generic names that meant nothing at first glance. But the amounts were inconsistent with any legitimate activity I could imagine. There was a folder simply named M. Inside, a series of transfers to an account whose ultimate beneficiary was hidden behind 3 layers of corporate structure. But the intermediary bank was clearly listed a Maltese bank, the exact one Arthur had mentioned in his handwritten notes. There were message exchanges in coded language, but not coded enough for someone who knows how to read between the lines of a financial structure. I photographed everything methodically, silently with my phone on silent mode, and the screen brightness at its lowest. When I finished, I closed the laptop exactly as I had found it. I replaced the lock, closed the drawer, and sat in Julian's armchair. I looked at his desk, the pens aligned with precision, the framed photo on the corner where he was shaking hands with a European politician, both of them smiling. I thought of all the people whose names appeared in these documents not as suspects or accomplices, but as victims. Ordinary investors, retirement funds, families who had entrusted their savings to an institution with a respectable name and a trustworthy face. And I thought of something Arthur had told me in his kitchen in Queens, holding his mug with both hands. The worst part isn't what he stole. It's that he never called it stealing. To him, it was just moving money around. I stayed in that armchair for a little longer, then I picked up my phone and sent the files to Mark. His reply came 2 hours later. We need one more thing. A direct conversation that links him to a specific operation. His voice, his name, without ambiguity. As soon as we have that, the file is complete. I placed the phone on the table. Through the office window, New York glittered in the cold February night. The lights of the city I had always loved, indifferent and beautiful as ever. Somewhere in that city, in ordinary apartments, families were sleeping unaware that their savings had been the bricks for a castle built by a man who had never seen them. There was one step left, the most important one. And I knew we would only have one chance to get it right. In the next part, the device in the car is activated. Julian gets in with an intermediary, and for 10 minutes he says everything he never should have. But something unexpected happens. He starts to suspect me. It was a Thursday in March 2025. A fine, persistent rain had been falling on New York all day, the kind the city gets in late winter that darkens the sky by 3 in the afternoon and makes the pavement of Soho shine like mirrors. The kind of day where it feels like the city itself is holding its breath, waiting for something without knowing what. Mark had warned me the day before. Tomorrow night, Julian has a meeting in the car. The device is active. If the conversation goes as I think it will, we'll have what we need. I hadn't slept not exactly from anxiety, but from that particular state of alertness that precedes important moments when the body understands before the mind that something irreversible is about to happen. Julian left the penthouse at 7:14 p.m. I was watching from the first-floor window as his car disappeared down the street. Mark sent me a text immediately. One word, gone. I went to my room, sat on the edge of the bed, put in my earbuds, and activated the app on my phone that allowed me to listen live to what the device in the car was picking up. I heard the sound of the engine, the classical music he always played at a low volume while driving a soundtrack for his own thoughts. The soft creak of leather as he settled into his seat, then the silence of a city being driven through in the rain. For almost 10 minutes, that's all there was. The engine, the music, the rain on the windshield, and me sitting in the dark of my room listening to a man I had once loved drive towards something he didn't see coming. Then the car stopped. A door opened. Another voice entered. Deep assured with an accent, I couldn't immediately place something between American English and another language I couldn't identify. Mark, who was listening in parallel from his apartment, would later send me the man's name, an intermediary. Someone who deliberately operated outside of any formal record, whose role was precisely not to exist on paper. The conversation started banally. The weather, a comment on the traffic, a joke I didn't catch. And then the tone shifted. For 10 minutes, Julian Thorne talked. I remained motionless on that bed, my eyes closed, listening to every word with a concentration I had never put into anything else in my life. There were specific names spoken without hesitation, with the casualness of someone who uses them regularly in conversations he believes are protected. Names of companies I had seen in the laptop documents, names of people I jotted down in a notebook on my lap in the dark. There were amounts stated with the same casualness figures that matched with some variation the transfers Mark and I had identified in the preceding weeks. There were clear direct instructions on what needed to happen with certain funds before the end of the second quarter, on how certain structures needed to be reorganized to avoid what he called, with a calmness that chilled me unwanted, attention. And then he said something I didn't expect. He mentioned the party in Newport. He described it as a positioning operation, a way to bring together in one place under the guise of a personal celebration people who should not be seen together in a professional context, people who had common interests and needed a space away from prying eyes to confirm commitments. $35 million for a party. It wasn't vanity. It was a disguised business meeting. I had to put my notebook down for a few seconds because my hands had started to tremble. Not with fear, with something else. That combination of cold rage and sadness that comes when you finally understand the exact scale of something you had sensed, but couldn't name. All those families, those pension funds, those ordinary workers whose savings had fueled a machine they never knew existed. And at the center of that machine, a man who threw $35 million parties to advance his business and called me a luxury detail in front of his guests. The conversation ended 10 minutes after it began. The door reopened, the other voice disappeared. Julian turned the music back on and headed home. Mark called me 20 minutes later. "Did you hear?" "Yes." "How are you?" I thought about the question. Really thought about it the way you do when you refuse to answer automatically. "I'm ready," I said. A short pause. "The file is complete, Camille. Audio documents, photos, transcripts. Everything is cross-referenced. Everything is verified." His voice was calm but carried something different, a particular gravity. "We need to decide the next step. What are you thinking? There's an event in 10 days. A gala dinner at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Thorne is scheduled to speak. 500 guests. The specialized press will be there." I waited. It's the perfect time for the authorities to receive the file and intervene in a public documented setting in front of witnesses who can't claim they saw nothing. I looked out the window. The rain continued. New York glittered in the wet darkness. "Then we do it," I said. But something happened that I hadn't anticipated. 2 days after the conversation in the car, Julian came home different. I felt it immediately. After months of observing him with an attention he never suspected, I had learned to read his moods with a precision I wouldn't have thought possible at first. And that night, something in the way he walked down the hall, the way his eyes scanned the rooms without his head moving, the way he placed his keys on the entryway table with a slightly excessive care told me something had changed. At dinner, he said, in a tone too casual to be natural, "You've been going out a lot lately. Where do you go? Errands, lunches. The social calendar you yourself asked me to maintain." He watched me a second too long. "Jensen is efficient," he said next. "Where did you find him again?" "Through a recommendation." "Why curiosity?" He smiled. That smile I had learned not to find reassuring. I smiled back. I changed the subject with the calm of a woman who has nothing to hide, because that was exactly the impression I needed to give. But as soon as I could, I sent a text to Mark under the table. "He's starting to suspect something. He mentioned your name." The reply came in less than a minute. "I know." His assistant started running checks. "We have 10 days. Then a second message a few seconds later. "We have no more room for error, Camille." Not a single one. That night, lying in the dark next to a man who was perhaps beginning to understand what was happening, I thought of a strange thing. I thought about the powerful men of the Gilded Age, titans of industry who built empires and held lavish balls in grand mansions, convinced of their own invincibility, only to be brought down not by their enemies but by their own hubris. History had a very particular way of repeating itself, and in 10 days at a gala celebrating that very culture of power, history might just write itself again. I didn't sleep all night, but I wasn't afraid. I was simply ready. In the next part, the longest 10 days of my life. Julian's suspicion grows. The danger becomes real, and the night before the gala something happens that threatens to bring the whole plan crashing down. The 10 days that followed were the longest of my life. Not because of what was happening on the outside, not the preparations, the last-minute checks, the daily exchanges with Mark on the progress. All of that I could handle. I had learned to manage it. It had become second nature, this ability to function with precision while something enormous was being built in silence around me. What was difficult was the inside. Living in that penthouse, sleeping in that bed, sharing meals with that man. Smiling, nodding, continuing to play the part of a woman who knows nothing, sees nothing, who is exactly what he had always believed her to be, except now he was no longer entirely convinced. Julian had been different since that night he mentioned Mark at the table. Not drastically, not in a way an outsider would notice, but I saw it. His gazes that lingered a fraction of a second too long. His questions asked with a lightness that rang false. The new way he had of coming home unannounced at odd hours, as if to find something he wasn't supposed to find. I didn't flinch. I changed nothing about my routine. It was the only possible response. But the pressure was real. On the 4th day, Mark called me from a payphone. That detail alone told me the seriousness of what he was about to say. Julian's assistant has been digging into me. Serious digging. My cover story is holding, but if someone digs deep enough and fast enough, there's a risk. How much time do we have? 6 days if we're lucky. Less if Julian decides to push. A pause. The file has been with the Financial Crimes Division since yesterday morning, he continued. They've confirmed receipt. They've requested 48 hours for an internal review before deciding on action. And if they decide not to act at the gala, they will act. His voice was firm. What we gave them, Camille, is solid. Audio documents transfers, cross-referenced with dates and names. This isn't an anonymous tip. It's a constructed case. They will act. I hung up and stood in the hallway for a few minutes looking out at the rooftop garden. The fountain ran as always indifferent, perpetual. 6 days. On the 5th day, something I hadn't anticipated happened. Julian came home in the middle of the afternoon when he was supposed to be in meetings until evening. I was reading in the living room. I had nothing to hide at that precise moment, and yet when I heard the key in the lock, something in my chest tightened. He came in, looked at me and smiled. That smile, I hadn't seen it in a long time. Not the social smile of the banker on display, not the condescending smile of the man who believes he's superior. A different smile, almost soft, almost the one I had loved at the beginning. He sat down across from me. We should get away for a few days, he said. Just the two of us. Before the gala. Maybe Street Barts or Lisbon. I looked at him. Now, 6 days before the gala, precisely. Before everything starts up again. He tilted his head slightly in that way he sometimes had that seemed sincere. We haven't taken the time in a long time. I sensed the trap without being able to identify its exact shape. Was it an attempt to keep me away from New York to watch me more closely? Or just a genuine moment of weakness from a man who sensed without articulating it that something was slipping from his grasp? I couldn't know for sure, so I smiled with all the warmth I could muster. That's a beautiful idea, I said. But the gala is in 6 days, and I still have so much to prepare for our appearance. You know how important it is to you that everything is perfect. He watched me for another moment, then nodded. You're right. He stood up and went back to his office. I waited until the door was closed. Then I lowered my book to my lap and took 3 slow, deep breaths, my eyes closed like someone who has just dodged something without knowing exactly what. On the 8th day, Mark sent a text. Confirmation received. The bureau will be at the gala. Discreet, 4 agents in plain clothes. They will intervene during the speech. I read the message 3 times, then deleted it. The night before the gala, a detail nearly brought everything down. It was 10 p.m. Julian was working in his office. I was preparing my things for the next day in our bedroom when his phone, which he had left on the nightstand, vibrated. I shouldn't have looked, but the screen lit up and the name displayed stopped me cold. It was a first name I had seen in the laptop documents. One of the names Julian had spoken in the car, that rainy March night. The message was short. 4 words. Someone is watching you. My heart did something strange. Not a leap, more like a stop. A fraction of a second, where everything suspended. I put the phone down exactly as I had found it. I lay down on the bed and closed my eyes. I had maybe 20 seconds before Julian came back and saw that message. I heard the sound of his chair in the office, footsteps in the hall, the bedroom door opening. I breathed steadily, my eyes closed with the slowness of someone sleeping or about to fall asleep. He stopped at the entrance to the room. I could feel his gaze without seeing it. Those seconds lasted a long time. Then he crossed the room. He picked up his phone from the nightstand. I heard the discreet sound of a screen lighting up. A silence. Then he put the phone down. He sat on the edge of the bed and said nothing. I didn't move. A long time later, when his breathing settled into the slow rhythm of sleep, I opened my eyes in the dark and sent a message to Mark with a single word. Tomorrow. The reply came immediately, as if he'd been waiting. I know. Everything is in place. Then, a second message. Asterisk, Camille. What you've done these past 4 months, very few people could have. Whatever happens tomorrow, you need to know that. Asterisk. I rested the phone on my chest. Through the bedroom window, New York was silent under the March sky. The city lights distant, like stars resting on the ground. This city I had always loved, where I had grown up, worked, loved, doubted, started over. Tomorrow night at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, something was going to end. And something else, which I couldn't yet name, was going to begin. I wasn't afraid. I just had that particular sensation that precedes irreversible moments. That strange calm that feels like serenity but is actually something rarer. The absolute certainty that you have done what needed to be done the way it needed to be done for the reasons that truly matter. Not for me. For all the people whose names appeared in documents as numbers, as accounting lines, as resources to be drained, and who had the right to know. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in months, I slept. In the final part, the gala, the speech, the moment when Julian Thorne, at the pinnacle of everything he has built, understands that the real game was never in his hands. And what happens next for him, for me, and for all the families who will never know my name? The Metropolitan Museum of Art sits on the eastern edge of Central Park, a palace of culture built on Gilded Age wealth. A monument to power, fortune, and the belief in one's own enduring legacy. Men like Julian Thorne felt at home there, seeing their own ambition reflected in the grand halls and priceless artifacts. They never considered that such places could also be the stage for their downfall, because men like them never look in the right direction. I thought about that during the entire ride, sitting beside Julian in the car in my gala gown, my hands resting on my lap with a calmness that surprised even me. He drove in silence. The usual classical music played. The rain had stopped in the afternoon, and the March sky had cleared, becoming crisp, almost cold, with that particular clarity that comes after the air has been washed clean. He hadn't spoken to me since the morning. I didn't know if he knew. I didn't know if the previous night's text had been enough to trigger something in his mind, or if he was simply in his usual state of tension before these major public appearances. He was impossible to read that night, even for me who had learned to decipher him with a precision I would never have imagined possible. When the grand facade of the museum appeared illuminated against the night sky, I felt something definitively stabilize within me, like a mechanism finally clicking into the position it was designed for. It was time. The gala was immaculate. 500 guests in the great hall tables, adorned with white flowers and tall candles, musicians in a discreet corner playing something classical I didn't try to identify. The specialized press was their financial journalists Julian had cultivated for years with the patience of a gardener who knows exactly what fruit he wants to harvest. I entered with him 2 steps behind as always. For the last time, the first hour unfolded in the usual ritual, the handshakes, the calculated laughter, the private asides with faces I recognized from magazines and political shows. Julian moved through this environment with an ease I had once admired and which tonight I watched with total detached clarity, like watching a theater performance when you already know the end of the play. Mark had sent me a text at 7:30 p.m. before I turned off my phone for the evening. They're here. In plain clothes. 4 agents. They're waiting for the speech to begin. I hadn't replied. I had turned off the screen and slipped the phone into my clutch. At 9:30 p.m., Julian stepped onto the small stage, set up at the head of the great hall. The applause was warm. These people truly admired him for the most part. Or at least they admired the image he had spent years building with a care that in another context would have commanded something akin to respect. He thanked them with that calculated modesty he had perfected. He made a joke about the venue. He mentioned a few successes from the past year, in language that sounded like a victory speech wrapped in velvet. And then he began to speak of legitimacy. What we have built, he said, his voice firm, his gaze sweeping the room with the assurance of a man who knows that every face turned toward him is on his side, is not just a portfolio. It is trust, the result of decades of rigorous work, of difficult decisions, of choices that many would not have had the courage to make. I was at the back of the hall, standing alone. I watched this man on this stage and thought of Arthur in his queen's apartment with his prematurely white hair. I thought of the families whose names appeared in columns of numbers, never knowing what those columns truly meant. I thought of everyone Julian had crushed, used, reduced to pieces in an architecture he had built solely for himself. And I thought of the woman I had been, the one who had smiled for hours in a Newport mansion under the autumn sky, the one who had nodded and changed the subject, the one who had chosen not to look. That woman was no longer there. It happened quietly. No sirens, no shouting, no dramatic gestures. 4 people crossed the hall with firm, steady steps, dressed well enough to pass for guests until they reached the stage. 2 men and 2 women. Neutral professional faces seeking neither theatricality nor escalation. Julian was mid-sentence, and that is why I believe profoundly that the future belongs to those with the vision and the courage too. One of the men approached the stage. He said something in a low voice. Just a few words. I couldn't hear from the back of the hall, but I didn't need to. I saw the exact moment Julian understood. It wasn't spectacular. It was the opposite. His face didn't crack. It froze like someone seeing something impossible whose brain is still refusing to validate what the eyes are transmitting. A suspended fraction of a second where the entire world seemed to hold its breath. The hall fell silent progressively in waves. The conversations near the stage first, then those in the middle, then the last whispers at the back. 500 people understanding each at their own pace that something unexpected was happening. Julian looked out at the room. At the hundreds of faces turned toward him. The people he had cultivated, manipulated, used, impressed. And then slowly his gaze traveled across the hall. He looked for me. He found me. I didn't look away. I didn't smile. I made no gesture. I said no word. I simply stood there at the back of that grand illuminated hall, and I looked back at him. And for those few seconds in the silence that had taken over the entire room, something passed between us that I hadn't anticipated and couldn't exactly describe. He understood. Not just that I was involved, not just that what was happening was connected to me. Something more precise, more painful for a man like him. He understood that the woman he had called a luxury detail, the woman he claimed to have pulled from mediocrity, the woman he had humiliated in front of 300 people thinking it would cost him nothing, that woman had been for 4 months, the only one who was truly playing the game, and he hadn't seen it coming. Because he had never looked at me. Not really. I left the museum before the commotion truly began. There was nothing left for me inside. The file was delivered. The evidence was in hands that knew what to do with it. The rest belonged to procedures, to judges, to lawyers, to institutions, whose work began precisely where mine ended. Mark was waiting in the parking garage. He saw me approaching and gave a single nod with that economy of gesture that was his alone. I got in the car. The door closed, and as we drove away from the museum, I heard behind me the muffled sound of a room beginning to realize what had just happened. I didn't look back. In the months that followed, the newspapers called it the biggest private financial scandal of the last decade. Investigations were opened in 4 countries. The names of politicians and executives surfaced as the case unfolded. Defrauded pension funds began recovery proceedings. Families who would never know the full story at least partially recovered what had been taken from them. Julian was indicted in March and placed in pretrial detention in April. I didn't watch a single news report. Arthur called me when he heard the news. He didn't say much. Just, "Thank you," in a voice that carried something words couldn't contain. I told him I hadn't done it for him. For who then, he asked. I thought of all the people whose names appeared in documents as numbers, as accounting abstractions, as resources someone had unilaterally decided to move without ever asking their permission. For people who will never know my name. I replied. There was a silence. They should, he said softly. I moved back to Chicago. At the end of the summer of 2025, I rented a small, bright apartment near Lake Michigan. 2 rooms, a narrow kitchen, a window that looked out over the rooftops, and a patch of sky I could watch change color throughout the day. I started working again as a consultant on my own terms for clients I chose carefully. There was nothing extraordinary about the apartment. The windows were smaller than what I'd grown used to. The kitchen was modest. The elevator sometimes broke down. But when I closed the door at night, there was something the penthouse on the Upper East Side had never given me. A silence that belonged to me. A peace I owed to no one. And when I looked at myself in the mirror of that ordinary bathroom, the woman looking back was entirely irreducibly real. Not a detail. Not an accessory. Not a luxury item in someone else's life. Just me. Camille Reed. 45 years old. Standing. Never underestimate a woman who has chosen silence as her strategy.